Check one. Check one. Sermon talk back will begin in just a few minutes. We're so lucky to have Bill here today.
All right, do any of you have questions on a card that I need to come and get? I thought I saw a hand. Beth, I know you're finishing yours up, so. I think we can honestly say that we have the faithful present among us, that you would be willing to hang out for another 30 minutes or so in the swelter to have a conversation. So while a couple people are finishing up their questions, first of all, thank you, of course. Thank you. Do you need a fan?
I'm okay.
Okay. So you gotta have perfect posture this morning, ladies and gentlemen, for this microphone situation. I was trying to make some notes, but I would write something down, and then you would immediately say something else that I needed to write down, and I couldn't write down so fast. So I'm going to try and share what was really sort of swirling in my mind. Every time I hear you preach, I just hear this undercurrent of church history, right? Mm-hmm. And so I automatically think about my mother, who has, anytime we would discuss any sort of challenges in our churches, because most of you know I've been in church my whole life, Baptist born, bred, and dead, and she would say, well, it's just been like this. Just read the book of Acts. Mm-hmm. So I think the thing that I struggle with and have struggled with is I don't see, what do we do with this concept of, when you were talking about Leland and, and then we can the list just goes on of ministers and theologians and churchgoers who would stand up and say, this is not right. The government cannot do this. Mm-hmm. And yet, we live in this place of the church cannot do that. And but it's not often, it's like we have no problem speaking against injustice, and I'm probably going to step on some toes here, but we can't hang a sign from the outside of the church building. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So how do we use our faith to overcome the challenge of saying it's not right for the government to do this, but it's okay for us to do something that might exclude another within the walls of our church?
Oh, wow. One thing I think that we start with, in particular if you have a historical base to talk about, churches have always excluded people, if not intentionally, but by the things they believed. And even so early, we all act like there was one church in the New Testament. No. How many epistles are there? There were as many churches as there were, at least as there were epistles, where everybody, they had a shared sense of Jesus. But Paul has to keep writing to them because they go in so many directions. And so there's a difference in excluding people because of the way the church lives out the gospel and the way churches particularly interpret their own theological and biblical approaches. And that ideally that should be something people realize and then decide to go elsewhere. But what was happening when the Baptists began is that all across Europe, church and state were together. There were Catholic churches in certain areas, but there were Lutheran churches, and there were Calvinist churches, and there was an Anglican church, and the Anglican church was what gave the Baptists the biggest problem. Well, about the only place in the 17th century that had an openness were the Netherlands, which is why the first Baptist church was started in Amsterdam, because they went there to get away from the enforced government. But see, it was government and church doing that together. And I think that's the difference. So you're living in two worlds. One, just like Leland said, governments, faith should not be the object of legislation. But also, faith cannot be coerced. And what was happening is when you were born in one of those church-state establishments, you were compelled to baptize your children. Baptism and citizenship were tied together. And it was the Baptists, particularly Roger Williams, I mentioned this last week, who said there's no such thing as Christian nations, only Christian people bound by faith, not by citizenship. And because Baptists were adamant that each individual should be able to choose or not choose, and that was between the individual and God, not between the individual and the state or the pet church of the state. And that was the world. But Williams would have said, people who don't believe like I do, well, I'll say it this way. Williams had no patience theologically with the Quakers. And he wrote a wonderful little treatise. George Fox was the founder of the Quakers, and he wrote a wonderful little treatise called George Fox Digged Out of His Burrows. George Fox digged out of his burrows. But he let them live next door to him in Rhode Island. That was the difference. We don't believe the same, so I don't expect you to be, and I get to criticize you because I don't think you're biblical enough or whatever. But you can live next door to me. And he welcomed Ann Hutchinson, who got thrown out of Massachusetts because she was, the male preachers, Puritan preachers, thought she was stepping outside the women's sphere of church life and claiming too much interpretive power for herself. Roger Williams welcomed her to Rhode Island, and she had a place to go after that with, I think, 7 children. So that was the difference. I'll give you another example. When the colony, the Catholic-based colony of Maryland was founded, they gave religious toleration to Catholics and Protestants alike. But you had to be Christian. And the original charter of Maryland says, if you don't believe in Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and you want to live in our colony, we will kill you. That was in this country, in Maryland. They were tolerant of Christian diversity because they wanted people to move into Maryland and settle the land and pay the taxes. But if you were not Christian, you were out. Rhode Island was the first of the colonies to grant full religious freedom to everybody, the people who believe nothing and the people who believe differently, including Turks, that meant Muslims, Jews, and deists.
I mean, so everyone just laughed when, imagining this state, this burgeoning colony, saying, we would love to have you if X, Y, and Z. And I think in every church I've ever been a part of, it's sort of that same sentiment. We would love to have you if, and sometimes it's beliefs, sometimes it's ethic, it's moral, it's political. And I think that's every time I come back to this concept of faith, and especially, like I said, with what you were doing today with this, and always this undercurrent of church history is meshing these two together, because it's so easy for us to laugh and be aghast and offended, but then taking that to that next place of, okay, how am I that here?
Yeah. And that's the paradox of any religion, about how you, and these days particularly, the divisions are so deep in the culture that they find their way into congregations consistently.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask this question, and then I'm going to go and grab Beth's card, so I'm not abandoning you. I'm just going to let you answer it while I travel. Dr. Leonard, you spoke of faith being a challenging and transformative pilgrimage. What does faith look like tomorrow as I work a job and take care of my house and my community and not travel physically from Ur to the land of Canaan?
Well, and I guess my response would be, that's the human condition. That's a little mini MINI statement of the human condition. So faith is at its heart, and what that text was about today, and it's a way of finding a source of strength, encouragement, and the early Baptists would have said redemption, newness of life, wherever you live and whatever you're doing. And it doesn't, I'll get in trouble for this, I guess, but it doesn't start with dogma. It starts with life, and it starts with where your treasure is, there will your hearts be. It starts with the Beatitudes. It starts with who Jesus is. And I'll take a minute and tell you a story. I just got an email from Steve Shoemaker yesterday, and he's written a new book on baptism, and he has dedicated it to our daughter Stephanie. And he sent me an email and asked, what's your mailing address? I want to send this to Stephanie. Because Shoemaker baptized Stephanie at the Crescent Hill Baptist Church in Louisville on our last Sunday there. We all had to leave Louisville. We did, 1992, and I was going to teach at Samford University. And Candace, my spouse, reminded me of this yesterday. We were driving home from Crescent Hill earlier, a month or so early, and Stephanie, who's, for those of you who don't know, is a person with special needs, and we had never talked to her about baptism or that, because I thought even at a progressive church like Crescent Hill, she didn't conceptualize well enough to understand what that meant. Stephanie says to us out of the blue, I think it's time for me to be baptized. She's sitting in the back seat of the car. I almost ran into a tree driving home. And so we took her to Shoemaker, and I have a sermon that called The River that I've written about this, and he was, from my point of view, our point of view, he was everything a pastor should be at that moment with her special needs. He did not speak to her about what she had to know, but what she wished to be. And she said, he said, Stephanie, if you are baptized, you'll be saying that you want to become a follower of Jesus. Do you want that? And Stephanie said yes. And we prayed, and then on Christmas Eve, in her 16th year, she went into the baptistry, and we were going to help her. And Candace and I were remembering that yesterday. A wonderful senior adult named Mildred Birch, who was our great friend, said to us, you all don't need to be fooling around with the wet clothes and all that. Go sit in the congregation, and I'll take care of Stephanie. So that's congregation. And you know, she doesn't know, Stephanie doesn't know about the atonement of Christ, or she doesn't know about the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, or all of that. She just knows that she was loved in a congregation that did that loving of her in the Spirit of Christ. And so Steve decided to do that on his own and told us about it. And we haven't told her yet because she loves to get packages. But that's a poignant moment of illustration that I would give to that question. And right now in the country, particularly among, and put this in quotes, evangelicals, it's the dogma that's become the divide, and you believe X, Y, and Z, and you're either in or not. And that's where, I mentioned it this morning, fundamentalism for liberals and conservatives has become the norm. And what fundamentalists at its worst says, fundamentalism is, I have the truth, and you don't. And if you say you're going to join with me, and this is on the left and the right, then I'm going to develop some tests that you have to either, on the right, you have to sign, or on the left, you have to affirm. And if you don't do that, then you're not really with me. And this has been my experience of the right, but I've also had a bit of it with the left. When you say you can't do it, then they say, see, we knew you never knew the truth at all. That's fundamentalism on either end of the spectrum, and it is rampant in this culture, not just in faith communities, but in the whole politics. And that's what we must, Diana Butler Bass has written a number of wonderful little online essays about responding to fundamentalism. But I hear that question and the others in that what's going on with us now.
Yeah, the first time I was called a fundamentalist liberal, it was very jarring, but it was true. Because growing up in the, I was not so steeped in the evangelical world, but the churches I was in were aiming for that. But I was fortunate enough to have parents who wanted me to be a thinking human being and not just a blind follower. But it is jarring. If you've never been told that you are a fundamentalist liberal, it's very jarring. I'm going to ask this question, and then my phone is blowing up because we have questions coming in, so I'm going to grab it. This is from Beth, who says, I love this question because I don't know the answer. Has there been another time in history when Christians thought they might just disappear? And the second part is, have you read Brian McLaren's new book, Staying Christian?
I know Brian's book, but I haven't read it yet. That's the start. The other is yes, and in the colonial period, only about 10% of the colonial population were church members. And that's why the Great Awakenings of Jonathan Edwards and the First Great Awakening in the 1700s and on the American frontier in the 1800s, that's why it was those two movements brought people into the church that really sustained us into the mid-20th century and developed a system for bringing people into the church. Not everybody, of course, but why the multitudes of so-called. But it looked like, and there have been places in a variety of cultures where Christianity waned, but what we're seeing, and this is a quick thing, but a very broad. I saw where Justice Alito spoke at the Vatican recently and talked about secularism as the thing that's destroying the church. But I kept wishing whenever and Bill Barr did that at Notre Dame a couple of years ago. What I wish they would do when Roman Catholics talk about that, I wish they would start every address by saying, I'm going to criticize secularism, but I have to admit that the faith community to which I belong sent a great many people in the whole world scurrying because of the sexual abuse that was carried out by priests and by bishops who protected them. If they start with that, I could accept what they say, I think. In the same way that, and I'll confess this for myself, as Baptists, we should have, in the South, white Baptists in the South, we should have started every address we gave about how you ought to live morally, et cetera, by saying, we use the Bible to support slavery and committed ourselves to an inerrant reading of Scripture on slavery that has not left us yet, that we still have residual difficulty with. We should have started that. But what worries me when we start dumping on secularism is we have to all ask, how much has in our case, Christianity in the country, I think you could say the same thing from Islam, certainly. How much has Christianity driven people away for a lot of reasons because we didn't live the gospel out in how we cared. So before we blame secularism, we got to look inside. We got to look where our treasure has been in our hearts and repent accordingly. And particularly in big churches with big names that start in on it, I think that's we Baptists would call that a testimony, where you have to repent first.
Yeah. One quick comment. Those of us at Southminster love Bill's grandmother saying of, if no sweat, she won't listen. Okay, so here's a question. Romans 1:17 states, for therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, they shall just live by faith.
Yeah, the just shall live by faith.
In life and throughout history, man has wronged man. My father always states that, quote, we must live differently than the world. In most instances, your actions should be the opposite of the world, end quote. With that being said, is there ever a time where we must hold someone accountable, especially when it means they may suffer as much as we suffer? The way of the world is to get revenge and immediately hold someone accountable. However, I have always admired the hearts of those who extend grace. How far do you extend the grace? Do we hold people accountable, or should we extend grace with incredible forgiveness and always allow God to move on our behalf? My heart says allow God to move, i.e. faith. What a
Well, yes, and I agree with the latter, particularly with the latter part about extending grace. But at some point, accountability is necessary before each of us can receive grace. And one of the things that has worried me about Baptists since I first started writing about this, Buechner referenced it in this morning, or I referenced Buechner saying this. Evangelism became what we call evangelism, having a personal experience with Jesus. And Baptists were unique with that and said it out loud and demanded it of everyone. You had to confess your faith, which is why baptism was for adults, quote unquote, not for children. who had no choice in the matter. But over time, the evangelical method in the country turned conversion into a transaction. And then we Baptists sold indulgences, Martin Luther would have said, because we made conversion once saved, always saved. Okay, I'm done. I prayed the prayer, I got in the water, and I'm not going anywhere. Jesus has me. And we stole the heart out of conversion as a transformation that had spirituality with it. But we made it, Buechner said, it's not a once for all. It's an on and off again faith. And that's the brilliance of grace. And once you make it a transaction, I said this last week, then conversion becomes an entitlement and not a gift of grace. And that's where so much of what conservative evangelical Christianity particularly. On the other end of the spectrum, liberals often wanted to have so much grace that they didn't make it clear how one entered into that.
Right.
And I think that's the tension that we're all in. And Martin Luther is the one who called out sola fide, the just shall live by faith, in that Romans passage. But then Luther, in his latter days, wrote this horrible anti-Semitic treatise against the Jews that called for their execution, and that Hitler reached back and used at the inappropriate time. So we always see through the glass darkly.
Yeah. This is another question from Southminster. The title of this is Fundamentalists. How do they believe that Jesus is a descendant of David through his father Joseph when there was a virgin birth?
Well, particularly in the Gospels, the Gospel writers tie it in to Mary and to Joseph too, as a way of writing him into the whole redemptive plan of God. The seed that went up from Galilee because they were of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his spouse, wife, being great with child, etc., etc. That's the biblical writers saying this was there from the beginning, and he's the heir of that.
Yeah. Karen?
Yeah, Karen.
So I have a question and then a comment. So my question, I'm going to go back to one of the things you said towards the beginning, that you made a comment that there are so many younger people in our culture that don't know, I don't remember exactly how you said it, but basically you said they don't know the essence of church, they don't know the essence of faith, and they don't know the essence of Christianity. And I keep thinking about those people and reaching out to those people
Thank you.
Great comment and question. One of the things that happened that we've lived through, there was a foundation from the colonial period to the late 20th century where Christianity was, and I don't mean this negatively yet, Christianity was the privileged religious community in the country. And it became part of the ethos of families. You grew up in church and you went to church, and then you went to college and you didn't, and then when you got married you came back, and when you had children you wanted them nurtured. I'm shorthanding here, but that was the system. So people sort of, I don't want to put this, people sort of automatically saw church as a place where they could receive the kind of guidance and presence and the immanence of God and the transcendence of God all came together. But that's what's vanishing. And I keep mentioning all these talkbacks last year and this year. The sociology of Sunday had a huge effect on that, because Sunday was the day in which implicitly and sometimes explicitly church was privileged. Mm-hmm. The shopping malls didn't open till after 11, and you couldn't buy whiskey or beer at all, or you had to wait till after 12. In Louisville, you had to wait till after 12 to do that, which I always thought was very fascinating. And that was, and that's gone. And it started going by the 1960s at least, little by little. And so now churches did evangelism, and they did reach out, and they did call people in the evangelical side to conversion, but they had a lot of help from the culture. Now that's not the case. So churches can't expect that people are going to come automatically or even implicitly. And that's one reason why for all COVID's difficulties, streaming has had a major effect, I think, to provide the church's witness in a broader way. And some of those people may never make it into the buildings of churches, but they may experience things they hadn't before it because it's been made in the larger culture. So it's push and pull. But that's gone. And this is my thesis now. This is the historian in me. One of the reasons that certain church groups are pushing the government to develop what I've called in print a neo-establishmentarianism, like the coach praying. They said alone, but it isn't alone, and then now moving for tax money to go potentially, out of a case in Rhode Island, to go to religious schools. Part of that is because the culture privilege of the church is gone or is going. And so people want the government to protect that. Mm-hmm. And that's the huge problem, and it carries us back. Just reading John Leland out loud to you all, I mean, he's describing now. Mm-hmm. And that's where the Baptist in me, I've called myself an old-timey Baptist because I still believe that church-state thing. And by the way, I limited my conversation years ago about separation of church and state because churches get tax exemptions from the state, and preachers get the housing allowance that gives them a tax break that even public folks, nonprofit folks don't get. Mm-hmm. So I pull back from that to talk about religious liberty and religious freedom. And that's the dilemma. And that's why we're going to hear more about undergirding, particularly right now it looks like, that idea about privileging the church ties in with Christian nationalism, because the evangelistic methodologies of many congregations are not working in the larger culture. They are in some, but not in many as often. And that's the culture problem that's impacted by the church. So all that's to say in answer, church has got to go to the people. Find ways to have what I've called signature ministries. That you decide, well, we can't do 5 things, we can do 1 thing, or we can do 5, but we can't do 8. And that target areas of life that may bring people in, provide services for the community in terms of responses to issues, and persons may decide then to move toward faith. But we got to go to them.
Right, and I love that. We're gonna just wrap up right here, because one of the things that is really exciting that you will learn more about in the weeks to come is what we are going to try and start doing to meet them where they are, which is really enhance the robustness of the virtual community. If you think about, we got 4 questions from people in different places this morning who are not sitting here in the sanctuary, and I think the challenge that I want to say to myself and then walk with others on is, we are Myers Park Baptist Church, and whoever the we is, whether they are in this room right now or whether they're joining us from Germany, we are Myers Park Baptist Church. And I think that the extra challenge is to not make it another place of us versus them, but instead to say we are Myers Park Baptist Church. Thank you. Thank you for sweating. That was not in the agreement, I know. And your
Thanks.
And your wisdom and your passion and your steadfastness you are a gift to us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful week, and we will see you when we see you.